really at the heart of this is a tension between the quantitative and the qualitative. There's a lot of data out there, but a lot of data does not necessarily mean good data. How do people approach that from their perspective, just in terms of making sense of that data and understanding what data is useful and can be acted upon?
We very much look at it as, data can tell a story in a good way and a bad way. You can use data for sort of backing up your arguments or tearing something down sometimes. I think it's important to always remember the angle that the data is coming from, and time is always a very important factor when you're looking at anything. We very often look at data to try and be reactive to something, to see how an artist's tracks are performing or how fans are engaging with things, seeing spikes in numbers. But I think it's always important to sort of see it in the long term, and to sort of see these moments in context.
We often say that data is like the new oil, which I think it's kind of a nice apology for different reasons. And the reason is, first, data is very raw. Data is just lines in a spreadsheet. It's just information that cannot be used at first like this. And it needs, as oil needs refining, it needs to be treated, it needs to be organized so that it is useful. So I think on your point about quality and quantity, it's not about just the quantity of data. If it's like very raw data with not a lot of characteristic, it's not going to be useful, but it's the way you collect it, the way you analyze it, and the way you refine it that will make it an essential tool and resource.
Interesting thing from a legal perspective when you look at data is always this tension about whether there is such thing as data ownership, and whether you can claim that you own the data, whether you can claim that only certain persons can have access to that data. When you are a company such as Dorian's company, and that data is a really big part of your business model, what can you do to monetize it, to protect it against utilization by third parties? And I think that's a tension that is not going to go away anytime soon. On the contrary, we see that tension increasing, and that's the key question most of the time when you look at it from a legal perspective.
One of the things that I want to talk about is this idea of the data being presented as this kind of panacea, this great solution that is out there, and it's almost taken as being synonymous with transparency. We've got data, so therefore everything's transparent, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. What are people's views on that, this idea of transparency and data, because they don't necessarily go hand in hand?
Yeah, they do often contradict each other, and I think it's also I think it's been interesting seeing the various DSPs and their approach to being transparent about numbers of subscribers or particular engagement, or times of day that people are engaging. Even it's very kind of secretive in some respects until they've got something that they feel is worth shouting about. That's kind of one aspect of data transparency.
There are two things about this that struck my mind. The first thing is, as an artist services platform, I'm going to take an example. It's transparency towards who that we should achieve with Groover, because we're an artist services platform. We talk to artists and also to the influencers, and one of the basis of our service is that the feedback that is given by the professionals is private to the artist. So if we need to be transparent about the data that is generated on the platform, we couldn't have our own services, because the feedback is supposed to be private for the artist. So there's this question of like, if we wanted to be totally transparent, we couldn't have this service available. The second thing about data is it has to be analyzed and understood, as Emily said, because in order to display them, to have all the data that Spotify is able to display, you need definitely to be able to analyze it and to show it, because if not, you're not able to display it. So the matter of transparency is not always a defensive thing, like platform not wanting to show their data, but sometimes not being able to show it.
One thing that is interesting to note in respect of that conversation is the fact that the recent copyright directive tried to address this issue by including in the text a new right for anyone working with DSPs to obtain information about the sufficient information to control the revenues and the royalties that are being paid. Mm-hmm. So there is now a new obligation that will cause the DSPs to share with the people that they have a contract with. So the DSPs will share information with the people they have a contract with. And then the assumption is that the person that has the contract will, with the artist, will then have to pass on that information to the artists and the individuals, because this is a right that has been created in particular for individuals.
A lot of this data is coming from consumer activity, be that on streaming service or on social media or email groups and so forth. How have things like GDPR affected the type of data, the way that that data can be used?
Various nuances of having to work out whether you have or haven't covered all the bases with the GDPR requirements, particularly some of the artists who were kind of active pre-GDPR being a thing and are now kind of coming back and probably completely culling their mailing lists down to size. It's definitely something that it's quite difficult to navigate still, I think, and particularly when you talk about sort of from the point of view of an artist having a mailing list that fans can sign up to, then having their web store, which is potentially distributed and fulfilled by a different mailing list altogether, and never the twain shall meet unless a certain box has been ticked there. So I think it's quite difficult sometimes for artists to really necessarily engage with the fans in the way that they want to, particularly across the different revenue streams that they have.
What we're talking about here with GDPR, it's more about personal data. It's, for example, your address, the number of your credit card, or information about your personality. And there's also something else that is like activity data. For example, how many streams you have generated, in which playlist you are, which is not exactly who you are as a person, but is an information that can be used. So it's interesting to do the difference between this. And I think GDPR has mainly an effect on the first type, so the personal data.
On the consumer side, it has definitely changed the way people can reach out. But you have more compliance, more regulatory. It's more legal work to make sure you're on top of everything, because it can be very costly if you don't get it right. Mm-hmm. I think that's the key takeaway, really.
So we've got all these individual silos of data, but we don't necessarily know how they relate to each other. How do you guys navigate that?
It is still very difficult to see where one thing is affecting another. I think we've kind of seen various examples where people are saying like TikTok is now influencing the singles chart, and it's very evident that those two things are going hand in hand, but it's quite difficult to ascertain where one starts versus the other.
Yeah.
I think that's the same across all of the platforms, really. And I think that kind of also speaks to the fact that most of the time during a campaign, your activity increases to such an extent that there's no one singular event that's going to have a massive knock-on effect. I mean, we do track things like sync to see how it's affecting streams, and very often you can see quite a distinct correlation with those things on the big shows. But generally it just ends up being a case of more is more. The more data you can see from different places reacting, it tends to not be so much one thing in isolation.
The reason why there are so many data silos, which is like completely true, is that there are a lot of silos of activities at first. So it's not only the data, how it is generated, but the change in the music industry. Before you just had to sell CDs and like what your CD sells, and now you have to be present on a whole large set of platforms, different platforms. So I think the issue and what is complicated is first to be able to understand where you need to be everywhere today, because the audience has been separated in these silos of activity. And the issue for me, and it's still something that I'm trying to figure out myself is more to understand these silos before trying to have the data about how you got performing on these silos through the data that you could unify.
I think it depends who you are. Again, if you have this data processing capacity, you probably are able to make sense, and you probably can pull data from all of these silos in one place. If you don't have the capacity, that's where it's a bit more difficult to make sense of whether something happening on YouTube can resonate on TikTok or not. I mean, we've seen a few startups. I think I can remember a few trying to address that and trying to pull together data from different sources, and using, you know, APIs that would be made available by all the social media companies to try and see whether they could tell a story by looking at the data and cross-referencing the data. I think the problem is it's always very difficult to build any product when you are overly reliant on APIs and getting something from someone else. So
has your approach to data had to change during the pandemic?
Looking at it from the different territories and how, particularly when Italy went into lockdown, the sort of music consumption, in particularly streaming, had changed over that period, and how actually within a few weeks it made a bit of a recovery, and that was quite promising. So I think it's like been analysing the data of in relation to the culture that's going on around it, and probably being a lot more aware of the different kind of stages that each place has been in and how people have been responding.
I think I'll go back to what I said before, is that the context changed a lot the activities. So what is happening, like the artists are not playing live shows for now, they are doing live streams. We've seen, and that's interesting on Groover, a big spike of users and people using the platform actually to do promotion. But actually what happened is that for now, I'm not sure where it is going in terms of activities. And I think the data is going to come afterwards.
One thing that we also see is that the data you get is also different depending on the type of platform you will use and the platform that you choose. And if you are going to use just a regular technology supplier that can give you a kind of a platform with nothing, just like Zoom would do, like they give you a platform, you can organize your meeting, but it's not a social media, at least not yet. And that will be very different from using a platform like Instagram Live, Facebook Live, Twitch, or all the others, or TikTok, etc. So I think it's also a question of what is the right platform to do the right thing, and potentially hosting a live concert. It might be more interesting to also choose the platform based on the type of data and the type of control you can exercise over that data. Whether you're going to, is it going to be a private, public? Will you have an invitation only type of event? So it's also a question of making sure that you are aware of the type of data you can have based on the platform you will be using.